to start today's video. And just for reference, the square that I have outlined here in Brazil would encompass the entire country of Vietnam. So you can get a ballpark idea of how much bigger and how much more daunting a task any military intervention down here would be. This yellow square is the entire country, not just the jungle, the entire country of Vietnam. Now, the reason that I used those interviews from Full Metal Jacket is things are not always as cut and dried as you might think. We have a sitting senator in Colombia right now. If we were to ever be so foolish as to put boots on the ground in Colombia, it would be much like Vietnam in the sense that there are people in Colombia that ain't so fond of the U.S. or U.S. servicemen. No more can this be exemplified than by this article. Now, you would have had to have been with my channel for a long time. We started covering this back in 2017. There were 3 Marine officers that were in Colombia, and they were taken advantage of with this drug called scopolamine. Burundanga poisoning. It's also called the devil's breath. It was used in this Wes Craven film from back in the 80s called The Serpent and the Rainbow. I'm sure a great many of you are familiar with it. But it is some very, very nasty stuff. It is not a drug that knocks you out exclusively. You lose your own ability to be the director of your actions. And in this case, with these Marines that were drugged and robbed, they gave up, to this day, an amount of intelligence information that can't be assessed. They were incommunicado for 14 hours with laptops, cell phones, smartphones, and tablets that were secure items issued by the government. And we aren't talking about a couple of lance corporals and a PFC. We're talking about a colonel that was in charge of Marfor South and his 2 assistants, 2 majors. It was only a matter of weeks after this that we had the issue with the Fitzgerald. I was laughed at a lot for tying this to that. But looking back now, when you add in the issues with Fat Leonard, it's something where I don't necessarily have all of the pieces in place to prove this to you, but it doesn't pass my sniff test. I honest to God believe that there was information gleaned from the electronics of those Marines that played a direct role in the knowledge of where the USS Fitzgerald would be and when it would be there, and what would be the best way to disable that vessel. Now, I'm sure a lot of you will say, well, wait a minute, this is, a different command completely. Yes, it is, but at that level, when you get up in the higher ranks of the officers, they have access to things. And given all of the electronics would have required biometrics to get into, they had access to that as well. For 14 hours, no one knew where this colonel and 2 majors were. One of the majors they actually did. He was down in the bar with another girl, and he was part of that group, but it was basically Mueller and McDuffie, the colonel, that got taken. Now, before anybody makes any assertions about the Marines themselves, they were not reprimanded nearly as severely as they might have been, because it turns out they were in an authorized area, and the quote-unquote the women, the hookers that were involved in this had colluded with a bartender to drug these guys. So it was a plan, and it was more than likely orchestrated by some foreign intelligence unit that very recently has banned the military from using all sorts of electronics, no matter where they are. So, just saying. Now, to put this in perspective, with the issue in Venezuela, I would like to use a little bit of a different tactic. And I know a lot of people might not tie this together, but I think it's directly connected. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware that last year there was an American being held in Venezuela. He had been found in possession of weapons he wasn't supposed to have, and around people he should not have been for just being supposedly an LDS missionary. His name was Josh Holt. Now, this is Josh Holt before he went to Venezuela. This is Josh Holt when he was released from prison in Venezuela. Here was Josh Holt when he was in prison in Venezuela. And here is the statement that we started with from Orrin Hatch. And I want to read this to you, and I want you to tell me what you think is the giant glaring error here. I'll actually just read the second paragraph because that's where it is. Over the last 2 years, I've worked with 2 presidential administrations, countless diplomatic contacts, ambassadors from all over the world, a network of contacts in Venezuela, and President Maduro himself. And I could not be more honored to be able to reunite Josh with his sweet, long-suffering family in Riverton. I want to thank Chairman Bob Corker for his pivotal efforts and that of Senate Foreign Relations Committee for their help in this effort. Caleb McCary. So, point being, does this guy look like he was starved, beaten, and/or tortured by an evil, terrible, horrible dictator? Because this is a screenshot from a video that he actually got out of Seb prison. And here's him getting on the plane with one of our senators. Orrin Hatch called the leader of Venezuela President Maduro. Now, ask yourself a question. Why was he President Maduro last year, but he's not President Maduro now? If the allegation is that he has always been a dictator and that he rigs elections, why did they not say he was just a usurper last summer? Or was that election not rigged? The 2013 one that put him in power, where he actually won and beat Radonsky. And if that's the case, why is it so unbelievable now that he would have won another election, given that he was the heir apparent to Hugo Chavez, who won an election back in 99 and won 4 more times in a row? And the most important thing about that election, and I'll leave with this, I guess, is this. He was a third party. People don't understand that about Chavez. This is not a guy who was tortured and beaten and taken advantage of by an evil, terrible, horrible dictatorship. There were, and this was him before he went, so I don't know. I mean, you can make whatever allegation you want, but I know a lot of guys that go to American prisons that lose a lot more weight than this. A lot more weight than this in prison. And given that we had a senator that called him President Maduro, I think we might, if you have an open mind, might be looking at something that is very different than what's being told by both sides of the story and both sides of the media, pardon me. To win 60% of the vote as a third party, which is what Chavez did. There were 2 parties down there, just like up here, that had been just taking turns back and forth controlling the government through the 90s. And he came in, Chavez did, as a third party and took 60% of the vote. What does that tell you? And he won 4 more times, made Maduro his heir apparent, defeated Radonsky by 11 points, then he passed away, and then Maduro beat him by about 1.5 points. And the U.S. acknowledged that election as free and fair, as evidenced by our own senator calling him President Maduro. What happened in this last election that the U.S. says made it all fraudulent and not free or fair? The opposition decided to not take part. The pro-U.S. folks decided they weren't even going to try. And the U.S., when invited to go observe that election, refused. The UN didn't refuse, and they ruled it free and fair. As free and as fair as any other election that has ever happened in Venezuela. So if the US recognized the ones in the past, why did they not recognize it this time? That would be the question you would have to ask. And why should we send American boys to go do a job that Venezuelan boys should be doing for themselves if that's what they so choose to do? And I'll leave it there. Like, share, subscribe.